Good day, good people. My name is Brad King, and you are listening and watching to the Downtown Writers Jam video podcast, which is part of the Solid Listen Podcast Network. We're coming to you from deep inside the Jam Bunker today. On the show, Robert McCaw, whose book Treachery Times Two is out in January. This was a great conversation, and one I was not expecting to have, which rarely happens, just in terms of like not knowing anything. And it was fascinating. It turned out so great. Robert lived in, we're going to talk about his bio in a second, but he lived in Hawaii for 20 years. So he's created this world in Hawaii, and he's been writing, this is his fourth book in that world. In the course of our conversation, he would just like, there were 3 or 4 rando stories that he would just be like, oh, that reminds me of a thing. And he would tell me this story of which I'd never heard before, which I knew nothing about. Which is not shocking, because when you begin to dig down into all the different cultures that exist in this country, you realize we have a very cursory knowledge of them. We have this illusion that because we're America, we have a shared history, and we do in some sense, but this country is also this loose confederation of different areas and different kinds of people that have ended up here who also have their history external to us. That has then sort of seeped into things. And then we talked a little bit about Alaska and a little bit about Hawaii. We talked a lot about Hawaii, a little bit about Alaska, just as like representatives of these cultures that we don't really know and talk a whole lot about. And so we spent 25 minutes taking a deep dive into that stuff. And it was fascinating. It made me very sad that we are not traveling right now, because now I want to get on a plane, even though I do not love to fly, which we talk about in the program, and like go spend 3 months there just wandering around. So Robert grew up in a military family, and he traveled the world, 12 schools in 12 years growing up. Graduate of Georgetown University. He served as a U.S. Army lieutenant. He earned a law degree from the University of Virginia, and he was a partner in an international law firm in D.C. and New York City. He lived on the Big Island of Hawaii for 20 years. And Treachery Times Two is his 4th book in the Koa Kane Hawaiian mystery series. He's in New York City right now with his wife. That's where he lives, although they have some other places. And you're going to be utterly charmed by him. He is just one of those people that you feel like if you're at a dinner party, and we talked a little bit about dinner party banter, that you're like, oh shit, like tell me a story. Like tell me a story of like this place. And he would very easily be able to pull out one of 10 stories that I'll tell you about that place. So before we get you to Robert, got some business. As you know, the Jam video series comes out on Mondays and Fridays. The Downtown Writers Jam comes out on Wednesdays. I need you to think about people that love books in your life and tell them about us. Shoot them a text. Grab the link, shoot them a text. Don't make them do work. People don't like doing work with internet-y things. So send that along to them. That's the best way for you to help us spread the word, to help these authors find an audience, which is ultimately what we're trying to do here, is to help readers find writers. If you have Apple Podcasts and you're on an iPhone, head on over there and leave us a written review or a starred review. If you don't have a iPod, I clearly don't have iPhones. I clearly use Android. If you don't have an iPhone, head over to the Facebook page, The Writers Jam, and leave us a review there. All of those things help us get found. You can head over to our website, thewritersjam.com. The video website, or the video web series, comes out on there. I don't know why today I'm having a hard time talking. All the videos come out there. You can also catch the audio wherever you listen to the Downtown Writers Jam. While you're on the website, if you're looking for books, we got reviews. We got a bookshop link where you can go buy books right there and sign up for our newsletter. And for a couple bucks a month, support everybody on the Solid Listen Podcast Network. Get bonus content, commercial-free episodes, and I will just say that we have a Bad Art Friend show, special show for the Patreon supporters coming out. So you should go get signed up for that now, because it's going to be a hoot. Molly and I have been talking about this, so I'm excited to record this with her. I appreciate you taking some time to stop with us here in the bunker. Get that booster shot. If you haven't got your first shots yet, go do that. As you know, we have a little guest, Pepper. staying with us for a few weeks while her parents are out of town. So it's nice to have a dog back in the bunker. And I hope that you will sit back for the next 30 minutes or so and enjoy just a really fascinating conversation that I had with Robert McCaw.
Yes, I went through 12 schools and 12 grades.
Wow. Like all domestic or all over?
All over.
That's great.
Japan, Germany, Panama.
Where in Germany?
We were at Heidelberg.
Okay. And where in Japan? I had a Navy friend over there in Okinawa.
We were at Sagamihara, which is just outside of Tokyo.
That must have, I mean, it's both hard as a kid to not have that grounding. You know, as you get older, I went to a small school and like I know everybody I graduated with, and there's a comfort to that. But there must also be some kind of like looking back on that, like you got a wide breadth of experience that would, I'm assuming, help you navigate the world in ways that other people can't.
Well, that and my military service, you know, when I was in myself, all of that, it comes out in the books among other places.
Yeah.
You know, and I, you know, sometimes at a dinner party, I'll tell people that, you know, what it's like to jump out of an airplane.
Yeah.
That usually gets their attention.
Yeah. You know, it's interesting because, you know, we talk about, my writing partner lives in Berlin. And I have a bunch of friends that were in Kaiserslautern and like military folks that were there. And so I used to spend my summers in Europe, traveling around. And I did that for like 10 years for 3 months at a time. And it's not the same as the military, but there is you get a certain perspective on the world when you are always in a new place and you're sort of an outsider and you're sort of trying to figure stuff out. Like I don't know, like at the end of the day, I feel like I don't know if it makes you calmer, but like there's a piece about like, oh, I can be anywhere and I know I'm going to be fine.
Yeah. Well, there's that. There's also, you know, unfortunately, Americans think that they have the answers to everything. And the truth of the matter is they don't.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people in the world who figured out better answers to questions than we have.
Yeah.
And we could learn a lot from them. And indeed, if you study history, it's the societies that have been open to trade and dialogue that have advanced. And those that have been closed, you know, they stay where they were and they ultimately lose the race in history.
I mean, it's not that different from getting older and making a decision, right? Like I always tell folks, like I had 2 grandmas. One of them literally kept plastic all over every piece of furniture in her house. Like she grew up, didn't have a lot of, neither one of them had a lot of money. But the one grandma was like, didn't want anything to be messed with. And the other grandma, I mean, her shit was torn up. Like going over to her house was great. And I'm like, there are really 2 ways to live. Right? Like either be afraid of this change or just like, you know, like come on in and let's see what happens. And
I mean, it's always been my view. What's the furniture for? It's to sit on.
Yeah.
Eat on.
Yeah. We played baseball in my backyard and we, you know, wore it out. My mom was complaining one day and my dad was like, we're not raising grass.
Yeah.
You know, like, that's not what we're doing. So you do all the military stuff, like both growing up and then you go in, and then why law?
Well, there's a story there.
Good.
When I was in Korea as a second lieutenant, the camp commander, colonel, called me into his office one day and he handed me this big, thick purple book. And he said, this is the Uniform Code of Military Justice, and I've just appointed you as the prosecutor in a court-martial case. This was back in the days when, for a special court-martial where the maximum was 6 months at hard labor, neither the defense counsel nor the prosecutor needed any legal training. But the rule was that the defense counsel had to have at least as much legal training as the prosecutor, which meant that both could be novices. So I put together the case. It was involved my principal witness was a Katusa, which is the Korean augmentation to the United States Army. So I had to do this through a translator. And I wrote my father, who was a lawyer, afterward, and I said, all this legal hocus pocus you've been talking about at the dinner table is kind of more interesting than I thought. And maybe I should go to law school. Well, my father, who'd never pressured me to go to law school, wrote back by return mail, basically saying, it's not a half bad idea that under the Soldiers and Sailors Relief Act, you can claim our residence, they were in Virginia, as your residence, and you can go to the University of Virginia, and all you need to do is to pay your state income tax. P.S. A return made out for your income as a second lieutenant is enclosed, and vote by absentee ballot. P.S. One is in the mail to you. You don't think my father been waiting for that opportunity?
You're right. That's what's interesting, because I've been doing this show for a long time. I started it 20 something years ago. I probably a third of the writers that I talk to have a legal background, because the law is all about the language, right? And you have to study the language and how it works. And so there's sort of a natural inclination, if you are into words and things like that, that may happen. So what was it for you that you were like, you know what? I think I'm interested in doing these novels.
Oh, well, that's another interesting story.
Good.
For 20 years, I had a house in Hawaii.
Yeah.
And I spent a lot of time out there. And as I got into what I call the real Hawaii.
Sure.
And I'm not talking about the fancy hotels. I'm not talking about Waikiki. I'm not talking about palm trees. It's a very complicated, multi-ethnic society with all the problems that everybody else has, plus a whole bunch of unique problems that they've got there. And as I got into it, I talked story to some of the friends that I made out there. People helped me. And I thought to myself, boy, I want to write about this. I want to share this. And I've always, when I was practicing, I did some criminal law and a lot of litigation. So I was used to, getting in and digging into the facts and putting things together and doing depositions and interrogating people and dealing with the government and all those things. And I've always loved mystery stories. So that was the genre I chose. And I did the first book starting 20 years ago. And it took me about that long to get it done. And after I finally retired, I said to myself, if I'm ever going to do this, I'm going to get it done now. And
yeah,
there are now 4 books in the series.
Mm-hmm.
There's a 5th one that's percolating, and they've gotten great reviews. They're all about the same set of characters. You can read; they don't have to be read in any particular order.
Yeah, you built a world,
and the Hawaii itself is a character in the book.
Sure.
The language, the history, the legends, the myths, the volcanism, the way the people interact with the sovereignty movement. All those things are built into the book, along with a lot of Hawaiian language. And there's nothing quite like it, I think, out there. There are authors who've built the setting into a character. Greg Iles does it. Lots of people do it, but they've never really done it with the Hawaii Society, at least the way I've seen it.
It's interesting. I have family that did the Alaska thing where the government paid people to go. I mean, they still do it. They pay you to go settle the areas of Alaska that are very difficult, right? That are cut off from, and the stories that I hear and what I sort of hear out there, like Hawaii is so, like, people don't realize, or maybe they do, like how far away. I lived in California. It's a long way away from California. It's not down the street. And yeah, Alaska it's a third of the size of the United States, like the 48. And those places, even though they are part of America, seem to have these cultures that exist very much outside of what we do here, not as like a strange or othering, but just like the things that you have to deal with are different than what you have to deal with in Montana or Indiana.
Yeah. And there's a history, the United States essentially expropriated this independent nation that had been recognized by international governments for 100 years. We moved in and took it over. We then said to the Hawaiians, you can't use your language in government when you can't teach it in schools. This was an effort to essentially eradicate the Hawaiian culture. Same thing that the Spanish did when they moved into South America. And right now, what we're seeing is a renaissance of Hawaiian art, of the travel by double-hulled canoe. I mean, you talk about the distance from California. We had people, ancestors of the people who were on Hawaii, who traveled 2,500 miles over a hostile ocean with no communication with anybody in double-hulled canoes. And we thought it must be a freak and that they actually managed to make it. And then if you get into the history, there's actually two-way trade that went back and forth. They navigated by the stars. They had no written language, so they did it with chants. There's a whole fascinating piece of this that's all about navigation and the way in which they traveled.
It's fast. I mean, it is fascinating in the sense that, like, it's always strange to me when I learn things about America that I don't know, right? That I'm 49 and fairly well read, but I'm also not surprised, right? Because if you are an island nation, what's the first thing you're going to do? You're going to figure out how to navigate the thing around you.
Yeah. Well, as population in the Polynesia grew, they needed to explore, and they did explore. Indeed, there's now evidence that they probably made it to South America as well.
Wow. And as someone that is absolutely terrified of the water, that kind of stuff seems amazing to me. Like, I would have been that person back then that was like, I will have dinner prepared when you get home. Like, I am not getting on that water at all.
Well, and if you've seen one of these double-hulled canoes, even the biggest ocean-going ones are tiny by comparison to anything that you and I would travel on.
Yeah. So what was it that took you to Hawaii initially? Military?
I went out there actually initially for an American Bar Association conference. And after the conference, which was on Oahu, was in the Waikiki area, I went over to the Big Island and was just fascinated. I mean, you land on the Big Island at Kihole Airport, and you drive north, and you think you've landed on the moon. I mean, we're talking about volcanic landscapes with very few plants, and in some cases, none at all. And then you go across the island to Volcanoes National Park. We, from 63 to 2018, was one of the longest continuous volcanic eruptions in history.
Really?
Was from an event associated with Kilauea at Pu'u'o'o. Went down, added miles to the coast, covered a roadway along the coast in places up to 35 feet deep in lava.
Wow.
And it's an extraordinary park. I mean, if you get a chance to go, don't miss it.
Yeah, I also don't like flying, so it makes accessing Hawaii difficult for me. But this is all part of that thing about, when my friends from Europe come over and I'll drive them around the country and they're like, where are we? I'm like, still in Texas. Like, we've been driving for 8 hours. Like, they're like, we'd be 5 countries over now. And I try to explain to them, like, this country is really a loose confederation of different countries that have kind of decided for various reasons to work together, but that there are really, it's like a little world here. You have so many different cultures that are living and doing their stuff. And you realize when you travel how little we know about all of them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've got the American Indian cultures, you've got the Eskimo cultures, you have lots of Southern cultures.
I'm from Appalachia, and like, there's a whole group called the Melungeon, which are a group of people who the DNA, they can't tell. It's been an intermixing of American Indian, Black slave, and poor whites that have lived in these areas, and their DNAs have mixed so much they can't tell. They're their own sort of culture now. And I'm like, that's just not a thing you hear about unless you're from Appalachia. You're like, wait a minute, what is this thing? There are whole academic conferences trying to understand like the genetic history of how this happened. And we're like, well, when you live in small remote places, not that racism and all that stuff goes away, but it interacts differently in different ways when you are together and away from everything else.
Well, and every one of those cultures, you can go deep and deeper and deeper
Yeah.
and deeper. You know, it reminds me of a little movie I saw at one museum someplace called The Powers of 10. And they start with a couple on a blanket in Central Park, and then they go up 10 times, and then 10 times, and then 10 times. And pretty soon you're looking at the world, then you're looking at the solar system, then you're looking at the universe. And then it reverses and it comes back step by step by step by step to that blanket, and then starts going the other way into the ground, into atoms, into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces.
Yeah.
And you know, that's what, you know, life is like. You've got people who spend their entire lives focused on little tiny pieces of the world, and they go deeper and deeper and deeper, and they frequently make huge contributions.
But yeah, and you know, I mean, not that this is the same, but like clearly that experience has impacted you enough that you literally built a world into which you want to tell stories about. As you like, I always tell people that aren't writers, like writers have a question or something that pops into their head that they want to explore. They're not setting out for themes. They're not setting out to like tell it. It's like, oh, this is a place that this is a story, or this is a character and I want to see. And you've built this whole thing around these experiences that you had, law, living in Hawaii. Obviously, you have a very progressive view of the world in terms of like people and travel and cultures. Like you have a curiosity about that. I don't mean politically progressive. I mean, there is a curiosity about what is this? And I want to understand this and experience it.
But there are some themes here too. That's the other thing that comes from my law practice. In Treachery Times Two, which is the latest,
new one
book, the protagonist is a cop with a secret criminal past. His father had a menial job and was abused by his employer. And when Koa was the protagonist, was a young man, he followed this nemesis of his father's into a remote area. They got into a fight, and he wound up killing the man. And instead of confessing or going to the police, he decided to cover it up as a suicide. And he got away with it. And now he's got the guilt. He's got the education that he got as a criminal, which he brings to bear as a cop. So he goes to a crime scene, and the one thing he wants more than anything else is not to get fooled by the perp. So what's there, what's missing, all of those things. And then you have the whole question of, we all have things in our past that we would prefer not to share. I assume you haven't killed anybody.
Not me and you, other people.
but where is, in Treachery Times Two, this past comes back to haunt him in a very dramatic and very, for him, dangerous way. And so you have the question of, where are his red lines? Mm-hmm. How far is he going to go to cover up this in various circumstances as the story unfolds? And so there is a theme there, as well as this world that you.
Well, every story has to have that stuff. I just mean, like, for you, this world that you've built has been engrossing enough that you've stayed in it with different stories, right? Is that this is sort of the place that, like, whatever questions you're having are being answered through these stories, like whatever the question that you have about your character or whatever is happening there,
right?
And that's, you know, not everybody builds worlds like that. Like I'm a nonfiction guy, so I sort of go from place to place. So I'm always interested when people are like, oh, I'm now 6 books or 5, 4, and you got a 5th one coming or 5th one percolating in that world. Like, being able to stay in the same place to me is fascinating, because I can't do that.
Well, it's really interesting to take that world apart and to think about various pieces of it. And once again, I can focus on a particular place, and then, almost every place that's described in the book I've been.
Sure.
And I typically, as one of my research tools, was to take cell phone photographs, so that I could later describe details that I might not have picked up at the time.
Yeah.
But you can go deeper and deeper and deeper into each little piece, and there's a story there.
Yeah.
So, for example, in what I'm working on right now, there's a place in Hawaii called South Point, which is about as far south as you can go in Hawaii. It's the southernmost point in the United States.
Well named then.
Yes, well named.
Yeah.
Well, there's a bunch of graffiti-covered concrete structures down there that are falling apart. And I got curious as to what they were. Well, it turns out that there was an airfield there. It was Morse Field. It was built before the Second World War, and it was a key stop on the refueling stop on the route from the West Coast to the Philippines and to Australia. Well, what happened to it? Within days of Pearl Harbor, the government decided that airport was an ideal place for the Japanese to invade, and they destroyed it.
Oh.
Really interesting kind of story that all started with some graffiti-covered concrete. Which, by the way, you can find lots of places.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking, like, I've been down to Key West where they have the southern thing. I mean, it's not the same, but like, yes, like all of those 4 points in the country, like, it's all that's kind of stuff is fascinating. Again, like that's the stuff about being in like traveling. Whenever I travel, I'm assuming you do the same thing. Like I rarely go to tourist places. Like I'm always like when we go through Eastern Europe, like my writing partner and I are like, let's just go into this village and just hang out and see what's going on. Because the tourist stuff is fine. And like, we'll pop by it a little bit, but we're always interested in like, okay, what's the shit we don't know? Right. Like I know where the castles are because you can see them. Like I want to go into the pub and be like, what's the thing around here?
Yeah. And just walk. It's really fun when you're in a foreign city to just walk.
Yeah.
And observe and look at the buildings, look at the people, look at how they're dressed.
Yeah.
All those things.
And I'm super extroverted. So I don't care if we don't know the same language. I'm like, we'll figure something out. Like if somebody makes eye contact with me, we're about to have some conversation. Because I love people. Because to me, that's where the stories are, right? The stories are in the people that you come in to like they're the ones that know everything.
Well, that's the other thing that's fun about these books is that I practiced law for a long time. And I met a lot of characters. And my characters frequently are cut and paste pieces of different people that I've known over time. So, if don't be surprised if you wind up in the next one.
That's good. As long as I got a nice cowboy hat, I'm okay with that.
Well, that on the Big Island, they have some of the huge cattle ranches. The Parker Ranch is 130,000 acres.
Wow.
And its heyday was running 60,000 head of cattle. And there's a whole big story about the history of the Parker Ranch, which goes back to when early settlers there gave King Kamehameha some cows, and he didn't know what to do with them, so he let them run wild, and they reproduced. Yeah. And before long, they had to bring in paniolos.
They had a cow problem.
Cowboys from Mexico and Spain to control the cows and build ranches.
I will say, in all my years, there are very few times you hear we had a cow problem.
Yeah, well,
they got a cow problem.
Yep, and they still have a wild pig problem. I mean, because the pigs tear up the terrain, and they're terrible on the indigenous plants.
Yeah, I mean, pigs are like rabbits to me. Like people think rabbits are cute. I'm like, rabbits are mean as shit. Like they're you don't want them around. They're not nice things. Robert, this has been fantastic. You are absolutely charming, and I'm fascinated by the whole idea of like the dive into Hawaiian culture, just largely because I think that is if you ask most people in the contiguous 48 states, there's a huge blind spot for that culture and what's going on. And all the nuance and histories of that. So I'm excited. Treachery Times 2 is out now, and you can get at.
No, Treachery Times 2 comes out in January.
Oh, it's out in January.
Right.
But you can pre-order it now. Yeah. Like it's
pre-order it now. And then there are 3 preceding books. The 3 preceding books are Death of a Messenger, Off the Grid, which you might be interested in because it takes you to some places that are pretty off the grid. And then the third one is Fire and Vengeance, which has been extraordinarily well reviewed. So they're good stories.
Well, that's fantastic. And so people got time to catch up on the series right now. But like you said, you don't have to read them in order. They are stories within a world. That's
correct. And you can read them in any order you want.
That's smart. That's the way you do it. Well, this has been fantastic. I wish you the best of luck. I hope we can talk again soon. And I hope people go pre-order the book, because even in the pandemic, pre-orders are still a big thing for people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, thank you very much for taking the time to chat with me. And I'd love to do it again if you were interested.
Yeah. And thrillers have become weirdly, like, I never read them until the pandemic, but they became sort of like that, and rom-coms have become the sort of comfort food of the pandemic, because they typically move fast. They are entertaining, and you can kind of go somewhere else and not be in your head.
Exactly. And people have said reading some of these books is almost like being in Hawaii.
I mean, also good since we can't really travel so much. So that's helpful. All right, buddy, you have a good day, and we'll talk again soon.
Okay. Thanks again.
Well, there you have it. That was Robert McCaw. His book, Treachery Times 2, is out in January. Go do the pre-orders right now. And what a lovely conversation. It's always, you go into these, and by you, I mean me. You go into these, and you're never exactly sure where it's going to go. Been doing this long enough that I trust we'll get to where we need to go. But I don't plot things out, because that's not how conversations happen. And I find, at least for me, when I do that, it sounds inauthentic. But as a traveler and somebody who's fascinated by different cultures, who's fascinated by the ways in which people do things, and not a curiosity, not in like, ooh, how does this, other person do these things, but just like, how do you live? Like, how does that go? Like, what do you do? Like the Venn diagrams, right? Like, what's the same? What's different? Like, how did it develop that way? Those kinds of things I'm endlessly fascinated by, because humans are so big and diverse, and you begin to realize like where you are geographically and where you are with the climate, and just all these things impact the ways in which you develop. And so, we like to think of America as this monolith. But then if you travel, like I've traveled all over the place here, you realize it's not. There's so many different parts of this country. And so talking to Robert, who, spent 20 years in Hawaii and, did a lot of research around the culture and the history and all of that stuff, fascinates me. And I hope it did you too, because that was such a great conversation. Before we get out of here, a couple reminders. So I want you to think of a book lover or two that I want you to send them a text right now with a link to the program. That is the best way for us to spread the word. And we can't do that because I don't know your friends. So you gotta help us out. The second thing you can do, if you're on an iPhone, head over to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review, either star review or star review and a written review. Written is the best. If you don't have an iPhone, head over to our Facebook page at the Writers Jam and leave us a review there. Don't forget to check out everything else on the Solid Listen Network, including the flagship Mother May I Sleep With podcast with host and Solid Listen podcast queen Molly McAleer. She and Nicole, the co-founders of the network, have been building this out. So there's a ton of programming that you can listen to, all very different. Pop culture, entertainment, that's sort of thematically where we're at. But I'm guessing you can find some stuff that you'll enjoy there. Don't forget, the video podcasts are all here every Monday, Friday. Find them on the Solid Listen Network YouTube channel. You can also catch the audio wherever you listen to the Downtown Writers Jam. The Jam is out every Wednesday. The surest way not to miss anything we do, get subscribed wherever you listen to podcasts. And remember, you can always catch us on Twitter and Instagram at The Writers Jam. Until the next time, we'll see you around the internet.